Good afternoon. I'm Colin Crawford. I'm the Dean of the Golden Gate University School of Law, and I'd like to welcome all of you to Prison Talk. The Golden Gate Law School is very happy to co-host this event with Agino School of Business's Innovation in Practice series. And we're happy, partly because we like to collaborate with other people on our campus, but more importantly, because like Agino and is represented in the topic here, Golden Gate University Law School has for over 120 years served as a school that is committed deeply to social justice in all of its aspects. And social journalism of the kind you're going to hear about today is a very important part of that. So it's really a great pleasure to be here and to be able to share in this event. I'd also like to convey all of our special thanks to San Francisco Public Relations Roundtable for helping us organize this event, and particularly to Ed Kamen, Jay Rooney, and our moderator, Ken Strand. So with that, I'll turn this over to Ken, our moderator, and thank you all again for making time to join us here today.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you, Colin. My name is Ken Stram. I'm the owner of Two Bridge Communications. We work with mission-driven clients that are improving the lives of people who live in the Bay Area. And before we get started, I just want to acknowledge that I live and work in Oakland, and I respectfully acknowledge the Ohlone family of tribes, the original stewards of this land. So let's go to Emily. Could you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here. My name is Emily Nonco. I am based in Brooklyn, New York. But back in 2018, I visited San Quentin State Prison for a breast cancer walk, and it really changed the course of my life. I started working with the reporters there at San Quentin News. I'm a freelance journalist myself, to explore how we could support reporting from inside, getting outside prison walls and into mainstream media. And that led to the founding by my friend and colleague, Rasan Thomas, in 2020 of Empowerment Avenue, which is a program that really formalizes those support systems and supports both writers and artists. So I've been helping Rasan fulfill his vision. It's been an incredible journey that I'm excited to talk about.
Eli?
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. My name is Eli Wirtschafter. Currently living in the San Bernardino Mountains in traditional Yuhaviat territory. And I work with KALW Public Radio in San Francisco, serving the Bay Area. And I'm the program director for Uncuffed. And Uncuffed is a training program and a podcast based in California prisons. We're currently working at San Quentin and Solano State prisons, and working to expand to other places around the state. And we are a training program in audio journalism and podcasting, giving people the skills and the platform to develop, develop job skills, express their humanity, and inspire change. Adamo was in our program earlier, so I'm really happy to be here with him, and I'm excited to get into this conversation.
Good. Adamo.
Hey, thanks for having me, and appreciate everyone that's here. My name is Adamu Chan. I use he, him pronouns, and I am a filmmaker based in the Bay Area, specifically Berkeley, and someone who was doing media work while I was incarcerated at San Quentin, and doing film, but also audio journalism and writing during that time, and have continued to do that since I've been out. I'm currently working on a film called What These Walls Won't Hold, about my time inside during the COVID pandemic, and yeah, kind of what I've been doing since I've been home too. So I'm really happy to be here and be on the panel with Emily and Eli, who I also have personal relationships with and who I've worked with both. Yeah.
Well, thanks. Let's say more about that. Adamu, what led you to pursue, or what allowed you to pursue journalism and filmmaking while you were incarcerated, and how did that shift your experience at San Quentin?
Yeah, I think you know, the first thing is San Quentin is a unique place in the kind of I guess, you know, prison landscape in that incarcerated people there have the opportunity to do media work. I was able to learn about filmmaking and also participate in different trainings and workshops with outside journalists and form relationships with those people. And of course, that's a great thing. It's something that changed my life, but is also something that I consider, when thinking about that experience, in that those things are available because they serve a function for the system, for the prison system, and that while we as incarcerated journalists were reporting on things that were happening from the inside, that was also, we were also doing narrative work for CDCR and for the system, and promoting this idea of kind of like progressive reform against the backdrop of no other prisons probably across the nation having programs like this. Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of the way that I look at all of this, is that it's not, it's very complicated and very much about like how we're both like working within the system and bolstering the system and promoting the system, while at the same time trying to find ways to navigate that and get out messaging that is undoing the harm of the system. So yeah, I mean, back to your question about why I pursued it, I think that it was a great opportunity at the time. At the time when I got to San Quentin, I felt like it was a great opportunity, and maybe didn't see the larger picture. But once I was inside of it, I think it really kind of instilled a commitment that I was in this privileged position and I had opportunities that other people didn't, across prisons across the United States didn't have opportunity to do. And so there was a responsibility in that to those folks.
Great. Emily, what inspired you to become an advocate for incarcerated writers and journalists? And I'm sure this could be a conversation in its own, but generally, what did you learn in the process?
Well, I grew up and am privileged and really cut off from the world of incarceration. I'm also in the media industry, which has contributed heavily to upholding systems of policing and mass incarceration. So when I visited San Quentin for the first time, it was really a realization that I felt like I had been profoundly lied to about the system, who's in the system, how the system was functioning, even as coming in as identifying as a progressive person who believed that mass incarceration was wrong. And so really started deeply interrogating the ways that I had been protected from the system, and also how I had, been a part of and contributing to an industry that had upheld narratives that justified the system that really, when you start to understand it, makes very little sense, or it makes a lot of sense when you understand why it's there. So those early conversations with folks at the San Quentin News, and just also understanding that there's just, incredible storytelling and reporting that's happening inside. And so often outside journalists think they're the best people to tell these narratives. And, it really didn't sit with me right that like the main people telling the narratives about mass incarceration were non-impacted people, mostly privileged, mostly white. That's what the media industry looks like right now, and has always looked like in this country. So started thinking about, how could I build relationships that I could play a support role in something that was more transformational, that really challenged the privilege of folks who were currently telling a lot of the criminal justice reporting. And how could we do that through these kind of inside-outside partnerships? And just as I'm deeply grateful that I connected with, I mean, many people at San Quentin, but especially Rasan, he's a visionary. He's someone who really kind of envisions frameworks that go far beyond himself. So we had that conversation about, can we work together to create a system, a support system to help center narratives from incarcerated people and get them to a wider audience. And that was the kind of the beginning of work that I think I'm sort of continuing the journey of what does it mean to be a journalist right now in a dying industry? What does it mean to tell the story of mass incarceration at this time in history? And how can we think about those spaces kind of more radically than I think the journalism industry wants us to?
Good. We'll come back to Rasan in a minute. I want to hear more about that. And Eli, how did KALW's Uncuffed get started? Like, what was the impetus, and why is it important for your listeners to hear the stories of people dealing with incarceration?
Yeah, well, first of all, I relate to a lot of what Emily just said about why I got involved in this. And I think KALW in general has a similar orientation. KALW has always had a focus on training the next generation of journalists and training journalists from underrepresented backgrounds. The theory being that the people who should be, people should have the ability to tell their own stories, and we should have journalists from every community that we're supposedly trying to report on. But really, as a public media organization, our goal is to serve the entire diverse population of the Bay Area. And that means not only that we need to be, quote, telling their stories, but that our organization and our news coverage should represent them as the creators and the makers, the media makers. So, I came up through KALW's Audio Academy program, which trains new journalists. We have a lot of different programs in high schools and all over the place. So working in prisons really fit in with all that. And it started before I got involved back in 2012. I think through some personal connections between people in the newsroom and people who are already at San Quentin. We brought in some audio equipment and started developing this training program. Some of the early students included Earlonne Woods and Antoine Banks, who later went on to make Ear Hustle, a podcast we really love and maybe a lot of you have heard of. And over the years, we were eventually able to get arts and corrections funding. So this is like a state-run program where CDCR, the Department of Corrections, gives funding to the California Arts Council to then give different arts organizations like ours a chance to come in and do classes. So through that framework, we were really able to expand and do more to bring the program not just to San Quentin, but also to Solano Prison. And we've kind of thrived within that framework. Though I can definitely relate to what Adamu says about the kind of compromised relationship that anyone working in prisons have. Like, you have to work, if you're working inside the system, you're working with the system to a certain extent. And I can go into more how that affects the journalism and what we're able to do.
Good. Before we get to that, Adamu, so I've been, ever since we started hatching this program, I've been focused on this quote from the story that you wrote for Slate last year, where you talked about artists, like those I'm quoting here, the artists like those at San Quentin, understand the work of narrative, that it's not only your object of focus, but also your vantage point that determines, that it becomes obscured and what becomes visible. Can you say more about that?
Yeah. Thanks for quoting me. That feels good. Yeah, I mean, I think when I think about that quote, I think a lot about, so I lived in Japan for a couple of years in Tokyo, and it's always, curious to me, like when I ask people about when they visited Tokyo or Japan specifically, and what their impressions of the place are. And generally, like, people are like, it's very clean and people are very polite, and it's just a great place to visit. And I think that my experience living there was very different. When you know a place, when you've experienced a place and had a deep connection with a place, you know, you see things that maybe other folks don't, you know, just in passing. And I think, you know, that there's something about the Bay Area that is very similar to that too, in that, you know, there are people who have the power to control the narrative of a place, right? And folks who come to the Bay Area who are recent transplants, which is like much of the Bay Area in the way that I've experienced it now, see the Bay Area in a certain way. And that there are people who, or, you know, there are ways in which you can see the Bay Area and in its sanitized form, and you don't understand like the historical context or the people that are not there or the people who have become invisible. And so I think that like folks who exist outside of that have a different perspective, right? They know a place, they know things that are kind of outside of the traditional narratives that are being presented. And I think that like we as journalists, it's important to understand how power impacts what we see and who has the power to control like what we see. And so I think that's like, to me, that's important when we think about like what Emily said about how the media has played like a huge role in kind of you know, what the prison industrial complex, like supporting the prison industrial complex, and like who has the power to present certain narratives, and the importance of hearing different perspectives and people who have been invisible and who can see things from the bottom. So I think that's kind of yeah, what I was pointing to in that quote.
Good. It's about storytelling and who's telling the stories and who's, you know, not given access to tell their stories. Which sort of brings us back to Rasan and Emily. Can you tell people about Empowerment Avenue? So you visited San Quentin and you were inspired. How does your organization support incarcerated writers and journalists?
So it's really based off the fact that folks inside do not have internet or email access. That's really the grounding of that, because if that weren't the case, all the support wouldn't be like the intermediary aspect on the outside wouldn't necessarily be needed as much, but because of that fact, it becomes necessary. So Rasan had his own writing career, but was really struggling to grow it because of that fact. So how can we create structures on the outside in which we're essentially serving in the middle to facilitate the pitching and publishing process of work? The other thing is payment. Rasan really feels deeply about advocating for fair compensation. We all know that prison completely devalues people's labor inside, but also Rasan was noticing when creative work was making it outside of prison walls, it wasn't getting compensated. So how could we like wrap that support structure with advocacy around fair payment? So what we have been doing for 2 years, just really, you know, trying to see what works and what kind of we found good rhythm with is one-on-one partnerships where we partner an outside writer or editor with an incarcerated writer. They work very directly to workshop writing. Then we help kind of oversee that outside pitching process. We don't look at these as mentorships. We think of this as political relationship building, collaboration, professional partnerships, deep friendships. The folks that end up working together and really work well together, I think these can be sort of like transforming relationships on both ends. And then we do our best to get work out. So that's been, I think in 2 years, we've helped publish or supported publication of over 100 pieces of writing, from op-eds, poetry, reporting, essays, you name it. And we've helped generate nearly $40,000 to incarcerated people. So it's been a ride.
And who is Rasan? Tell people who Rasan is.
So yes, so sorry, was talking about the process. So Rasan, Eli mentioned Ear Hustle. You might know him. He is the inside co-host on Ear Hustle. But he is a man of many talents. He's a writer, a podcaster, a producer, an advocate. He works with Initiate Justice on their voting rights campaign. And so he does a lot. And he was recently granted commutation by Governor Newsom. So we are really hoping that he's home by the end of the year. And Rasan is just someone who has built communities around him, visions, innovative ways of doing work. And I think that the sort of key thing about Rasan's work is he's always thinking of how do we build partnerships that like defy the boundaries of prison? How can we always be thinking like across prison walls? How can we be talking about liberation in a way that it impacts all of us, and that the work that we do together is beneficial for all of us? So, you know, his spirit is here with me. It's always heartbreaking when I do these things and he can't be here with us. But, you know, the hope is that he's going to be home soon and would be taking my space in the Zoom room for presentations like these.
So I think Eli, I sort of want to throw this out to everybody a little bit, but starting with Eli, like there are like real barriers, like 15-minute phone calls and lack of internet. So how do you, I guess sort of, again, from the outside and from the inside, how do you manage to get a story completed when you have such significant structural barriers in your way?
Yeah, I mean, for us, the way we navigate it is to be an official program of the prison, and that gives us different kinds of access. So like, and actually, if a journalist cannot show up at a prison and request an interview with a specific individual, at least in California prisons, that's something you can't do. If you're a journalist, you could get in touch by mail, you could talk with someone over the phone in those 15-minute conversations. You could arrange to be like a personal visitor of someone and meet with them, like, but you know, often there's going to be restrictions on how much you can take notes and things like that. So our orientation is this is all a creative project and a rehabilitative project for the participants inside. And so under that umbrella, we can bring in audio equipment, we can bring in computers for them to edit on, hard drives, microphones, headphones, and they produce they produce the content. They'll interview other incarcerated people. It's their voices, and they're the main drivers of they do the editing work inside as well. To get things out, we need to clear things through a public information officer at each of the prisons. Ear Hustle listeners will know Sam Robinson, who's the PIO at San Quentin, and so we also work with his counterpart at Solano. And so, yeah, I mean, we have to be real that like that is a very serious restriction on what we can produce in terms of content, because because they're not going to let out just anything, and in terms of volume, because there's a limit just in our relationship with them. How much can we ask to, for them to get out and to get it out in a timely manner? I've learned I will say it's been pretty rare that we've actually been told, no, you can't put that out. Usually the participants have a pretty clear idea of what's going to be okay to say and what's not. And often it's things like they don't, want to identify a particular guard by their name or something like that. But it's definitely a limitation that other kinds of journalists on the outside don't have to worry about dealing with a public information officer that way. During the pandemic, it's definitely been a lot harder still because we've had very limited access to go inside and teach. And I could go into that for ages, but basically we've had to do things like sending in and out letters, receiving and recording phone calls, and also just working more with formerly incarcerated people as a different way of telling the story while we have limited access to go inside and while our participants have had limited access to the computer labs and the media centers. But I'm happy to say, at least at San Quentin now, the media center is open and people are going in there and telling some really powerful stories. I'm excited to get on the Uncuffed podcast very soon.
And Adamo, so you, on the flip side, when you were at San Quentin, like what were some of the, and I feel like based on our conversations, things are evolving pretty quickly, in part because of the pandemic. So what were the barriers, just to telling your story, just to, filming something or writing something and get it out in the world?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think, before the pandemic and I will say that like COVID definitely, I feel like changed how reporting was done on the inside, both from incarcerated journalists and from folks on the outside. But I would say like before the pandemic, there were certain stories that I feel like were not able to get out. Things that were very critical of the system or dealt with political like topics or issues were kind of felt like were non-starters. But I think one of the other things that I also considered during that time was like the way in which like we as incarcerated journalists would self-censor and think that certain things would not get cleared. And I think I was always surprised about like certain things that were able to get cleared. And I think that speaks to just the resiliency of the system itself, in that like one story that is critical of the system is not going to like topple it. And like what that means as far as like how much it actually benefits the system versus like what is actually being said. But to speak to the way that things changed during COVID, I think that the first thing is that I feel like people were very creative about the ways in which they were reporting from the inside. So one of the things that's not restricted, or I would say restricted to a lesser degree, right? So like letters that go out of the prison are reviewed as they go out of the prison, but generally are not censored in the same ways that like media that's presented to the public information officer is, right? Like a media piece. So I think people were using that as a mode of communication to news agencies and reporters, reporting from the inside through letters, and then also through phone calls, which are also reviewed, but not necessarily like in real time, right? And I think that the other part of that is that like during COVID, there was a certain urgency that maybe doesn't exist during quote unquote normal times, right? In that people were dying and people were getting sick. And I think that changed the way in which people were like viewing risk, right? I know that like during that time, I was a part of a coalition that was like dealing directly with a lot of news agencies and reporters to report on what was happening inside of the prison during the largest outbreak in the United States at the time, in the summer of 2020. And there were a lot of questions about like what was the risk of speaking out from the inside? Like what was the risk to my personal safety? Like could that, could me speaking out publicly and like without being anonymous, like how would that impact my own freedom? Would I go to the hole? Would it impact, a potential like parole board hearing or something like that? And I think those were things that like we as incarcerated people were willing to, I think it impacted the ways in which like we were fearful of repercussions. Yeah, that was really inspiring. and really kind of transformational for me to think about what we could do collectively to kind of speak up during a moment of urgency. And then also realizing that it's always a moment of urgency, right? That this is something that's always impacting us. And what does it mean to speak collectively all the time and to work together in that way to raise up our voices? So I'm not sure what the initial question was, but I think
I wanted to keep going with the question, but first I see some questions. We're going to carve out the last 10 minutes of this and answer questions from the audience. So we're not ignoring you. We're going to do it at the end of the event. So yeah, I mean, if people want to understand really what it was like, I mean, Adamu has work that you can find online. You can listen back up and read some of Emily's work about sort of the conditions in for incarcerated people during COVID, but I'm wanting to explore just a little bit more. You know, there was a movement happening with telling these stories. Empowerment Avenue sort of was created. These organizations were created before COVID, and then COVID happened. So not the COVID's effects on the people, on the health of the people, but COVID's effects on the system. And again, creating this urgency for the work, because otherwise people really, it would be hard to understand the truth about what was happening inside. So Emily and Eli.
I mean, I want to build off what Adamu was saying, because it was sort of this, you know, I think about those months. We actually officially launched in the summer of 2020 during COVID, right before San Quentin fell into its massive outbreak. And I want to really, all of the reporting and the organizing that was happening was just so powerful. I was working with a reporter at San Quentin who does incredible work, Juan Haynes, who was sick with COVID in a solitary confinement cell, which is how they were treating COVID, on the phone, reading his handwritten reporting that I was then recording. And on the outside, we were transcribing, creating a digital copy, and getting it out. And we also used some of the actual recordings of just his voice talking about what was happening. And, you know, I think I really thought a lot about, there are like certain rules we're told to follow in journalism that I don't know if I really believe most of them anymore. Like, I just think there are so many ways to tell a story, especially when the story is that urgent. And I also I'm been increasingly thinking of journalism more like organizing, like how can we create more participatory models that are rooted in social justice and not apologetic about that. And I think what happened at San Quentin was you saw incredible organizing, you saw incredible storytelling. There was a lot of intersection between those two things. And it showed what was possible, although none of that should have happened. We should have never even been in that position. And that, you know, and I also want to say that San Quentin is still too overcrowded. You can follow the news about the lawsuit that basically we thought it was going to get decarcerated, and it hasn't been. So we're still in the same position, even coming out of COVID. So then I asked the question as a, you know, an advocate and a reporter, like, okay, the storytelling wasn't enough. So what do we have to do next? Or how do we have to transform the storytelling even deeper?
I'm thinking about what Adamu said, that, you know, it's always a crisis in prisons, and that's absolutely true. And you know, the COVID brought special attention to prisons, I feel like, for a pretty short window. And, you know, in the bubble I was in, it was really huge news, but I would talk to people outside the bubble and they'd be like, oh yeah, I didn't really think about how COVID was impacting prisons, because I was thinking about how it was affecting, you know, my school and my job and my transportation, all these major things we were all going through. But yeah, you know, the conditions that made COVID spread so quickly inside prisons are the same conditions that people are were suffering with before the pandemic and after, and with many other types of sicknesses. I mean, things you don't really hear about so much on the outside are like, Legionnaires and different diseases like that are quite common inside prisons, just because of the density of the housing and the poor health conditions and the ways that so much about the way people live and are treated leads to poor health outcomes. So, I mean, everyone could see that coming as soon as it was clear that there was a big pandemic approaching. And I'm grateful that during the peak of things, that there was that interest from other outlets, so that we could say, hey, we have these recordings of the guys talking about what's happening there, and people were interested. It forced us and allowed us to be innovative in new ways. Like I said, recording phone calls of our participants. We did a couple episodes with letters between incarcerated people and their loved ones. And so their loved ones would record, their messages of love and support. And another new thing we were able to do during the pandemic is put our episodes out through the prison system's TV as just like an audio only product, but to help people feel more connected on the inside through those stories. But the crisis there is ongoing. There were, like the rest of the country, there were more cases during Omicron than any other time. There are still hundreds of cases now in prisons, because of how crowded the conditions are and how easy it is for things to spread, and the ways that the system likes to respond to challenges. Whenever there's even a small outbreak, yards go on lockdown and programs are canceled and people can't see their loved ones. And there's a risk that people's parole hearings and important events for their freedom get canceled and changed. So even though it often feels like on the outside COVID is mostly a thing of the past, they're still living it, both because of the health effects and because of the way it's affecting their movement and life. And another important fact to know for context is, at least in California, even though we have lots of state employee vaccine mandates and healthcare worker mandates, there's no vaccine mandate for officers in the California prisons due to strong opposition from the officers union.
I just have one quick thought and then I'll shut up. But, with the pandemic, I also want to say, like, all of the big issues we're dealing with now in the world, I particularly think about climate change. Like, the folks inside, that we have this system that has so many people inside prisons, those are always the people that are going to be impacted the most in all of the things that we have ahead for us. And so again, it's just unacceptable that the media does not have more frameworks to directly have storytelling when we're entering periods of crisis after crisis. We know who's getting impacted the hardest, and we keep making assumptions that the people who are not impacted can keep telling these stories.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And climate change and wildfires is a great example of that in California. Most prisons are in deadly hot places, and most fires are being fought by teams of incarcerated people. And so what's it like to be in a prison as you're getting smoke coming in through the windows, and you're wondering if it's even possible to evacuate. It's a really important stories to tell, and I think we're often not thinking about them from there is a lens of incarceration on every story, and like Emily said, like, they're so impacted by everything, and they understand it, and they know how to, they have the skills and the power to tell those stories. It's just who's coming over to listen.
So I'd like to hear Emily and everyone, again, KLW and Next City. Emily does a lot of writing for Next City, which focuses on solutions journalism. So I'd like to hear more about the new rules of journalism and how it, again, perhaps due to the pandemic, there's a more aggressive shift. So you can talk about solutions journalism, and I'd like to hear all three of you talk about that, even if it's maybe not a label that you would put on yourself or your organization.
Yeah, I mean, I think I consider myself a pretty radicalized journalist, particularly in doing this work. I think when you're working with people who have been marginalized from the media industry and you try and create support structures of how to take down those systems, you're like, oh, these systems are intense. Like they're real. We have to build new models. It's not enough to like tweak the system of media. It's not enough to tweak the system of mass incarceration. I'm interested in solutions journalism because it looks at things that are working. It looks at the agency of communities to tackle issues on their own. I think something that's hard is a lot of solutions journalism responds to deeper systemic issues that communities cannot solve on their own, but also it can serve as a blueprint to show that people know what they need and how to create structures and support systems around what they need. So I was working with the Solutions Journalism Network last year on a fellowship to see how we could seed solutions journalism inside prisons with the idea that folks who are currently incarcerated should be the ones talking about what we need to be getting out of mass incarceration, to be taking down prisons, to be returning folks to their communities, resourced and supported and valued. And again, it should not be outside reporters telling the dominant narratives around that. So it was a really interesting year of work. And it also touched upon what Adamu brought up earlier in this conversation, where there was coverage too around rehabilitative programs that are really, impactful for folks who are incarcerated right now and are serving immediate needs, but also being mindful of we don't want the narratives to be justifying that, let's say, someone should have to be incarcerated to get drug treatment or drug counseling for addiction. So we were kind of always asking that question.
Good. Adamu?
Yeah, I think the other thing that I just wanted to add to that too is if like we're talking about kind of journalistic practices and ethics, I think I have a lot to say about that. But I think just the main thing that I would say is just like around objectivity. And I think that like, the last several years now, kind of, I feel like broader society's kind of education about racial justice and about police violence has been like very much informed by like this very visible like killing of like Black and brown people that people have seen, right? And just like the realization that for a lot of people that these structures and these systems are not like paragons of objectivity, right? That for example, the police have a very different narrative about the way that things are happening. And then when we see them with our own eyes, like we're realizing that, yeah, these things are not true, right? And so I think, just back to my point earlier about like how, there are narratives that are created by systems that support them and that like we need to consider like power when we are thinking about the stories that we tell, and that objectivity is not something that's real. everyone has a point of view and a point of reference and a vantage point. Yeah, I just think that this idea of objectivity is kind of BS, and it's kind of a lie that we've been told about how journalism should be served up.
Yeah, and it seems like this has been KALW's business model for a long time. Do you affix the label of solutions journalism to the work that you're doing?
KALW does solutions journalism. It's something we've picked up more in our newsroom, and definitely this conversation about is there such thing as objectivity is happening more and more, and I think we're more and more accepting that everyone comes from somewhere, and certainly the government narrative of facts or whatever isn't necessarily that's not an objective narrative either. And usually, as Adama was saying, the idea of objectivity meant from a perspective of white male dominance and capitalism and the system as it is. Because of the particular constraints of our program and the way we're working as a rehabilitative program and everything with the public information officer and how hard it is to get information in and out, our angle is not solutions journalism. Our angle is humanization. It's our belief that the system is allowed to thrive, if you could call this thriving, because our society dehumanizes people who it labels criminals. And that's how it works. And we can forget about people who are in prison because we don't think of them as human. And they're even taught not to think of themselves as human, but they know they are. And obviously, like, our program is not humanizing them. They're already human. But they are able, through the program, to share and reveal their humanity and express their humanity in all its forms through storytelling, to each other, to other people on the inside, and to people on the outside. And that's our theory of change that works within the constraints we have as a program. But then, the other piece of this is that we train people who can go on to do all kinds of journalism or advocacy outside of the program and after the program. So people like Adamu, people like Adnan Khan, he was writing editorials in the New York Times. People like Chanton Bun, one of our graduates, who's now working in advocacy on reform of the relationship between CDCR and ICE and immigrants' rights within the carceral system. So people can take the kind of tools that they're developing in our program and then apply them as advocates, activists, or solutions journalists. And that's one of the sneaky things we're doing.
So we only have a minute before we get into Q&A. So I just want to ask, like, what's a call to action? Someone asked, the first question was, where do people go for more information? I would say follow everyone you see here on social media, follow Empowerment Avenue and We Are Uncuffed. Again, starting with Adamu, like, what's a call to action? What should people take away from this and further pursue the subject?
A call to action. I mean, I think that, for journalists who are considering these topics, I think that, taking a deeper look at how reporting is being done and considering, your positionality as a journalist, but also like the people who you're reporting on and getting stories from. I feel like, to me, that's one of the most important things. I think I see media as such an important part of, especially over the last several years, of like how people are interpreting the world and how they're moving through the world. And yeah, I feel like it's a huge responsibility for people who are facilitating stories getting out to the world, to begin to like consider the things that like we're talking about today. So yeah.
So we could just head into Q&A, and I think somebody from GGU is going to come back. But Eli and Emily, like, don't hesitate to share your, like, where people should go for more information.
Yeah, I mean, I'll build off that. I want privileged journalists to be thinking of how they're actively shifting power out away from themselves and the institutions that they're a part of. And it is hard. It's can be an uncomfortable journey. There are support systems. Empowerment Avenue is one of them. I do not think it's enough to say, oh, our newsroom, you know, we cover diverse communities and that's okay. We're doing enough. The status quo is okay, because I think journalists at their heart know that the status quo of our industry right now is really terrible. There's not much to defend about the media industry and the state of the media industry right now. So it's a time for building new structures. It's a time to be bold and courageous. And there's a role for people who've had privilege and who still love this work. And it can be, I think we sort of frame a narrative around transferring power as like something's being taken away from you and you need to be afraid and defensive. Actually, this work is really rewarding. It's going to make you a better reporter, probably a better person too. And I encourage folks who are thinking about that to really commit to the journey.
Absolutely, I agree with that. It's totally made us and our newsroom better reporters and better better stewards of our mission to have these connections with incarcerated people and their communities. So if you're in a position where you can help make those connections in your organization, it is going to make you and your organization stronger. I shared out information of how to listen to Uncuffed. You can find it in any podcast player, our website, We Are Uncuffed. We've also been having live conversations on Instagram. Adam has actually been in them. It's all formerly incarcerated people discussing important issues related to incarceration. So I recommend that for listening, for reading. The Marshall Project is great, and they do a lot of reporting in collaboration with incarcerated people. And yeah, if you're doing a PR thing or a journalism thing that might have some relationship to incarcerated people, make sure they're represented in your story, and reach out to an organization that might have connections to people on the inside, like Empowerment Avenue, or whatever organizations are in your area, and do what you can to get their voices included, and then see if they can become partners in creating in crafting the narrative.
So GGU, should I just dive into the questions here? Okay. So Molly asked, what are the best places to read and hear the work of incarcerated journalists? I think we already discussed a number of those, but we'll be sending out a follow-up email to attendees, and we'll add further information to that. Jamie asks, what specific types of support do you aim to gain, garner, and grow from the public with your advocacy, journalistic, and storytelling efforts to have more voices heard from the inside and the incarcerated? I guess that's, where's this going next?
Adamu, do you have any thoughts?
Sorry, I missed the question. Can you go first?
What specific types of, what would you love to see? What kind of supports would you love to see from, like, with the public, through advocacy, through your storytelling efforts, to have more voices heard? So how do we get more people involved? How do we expand? How do you scale this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to kind of like what Emily and Eli were saying, which is that I think that yeah, I mean, I think traditionally when we're talking about the media space, there are these lines between who are journalists and who are subjects. And I think that, it's important to kind of think about like the ways in which like collaborations happen and how from the position of a journalist, we can think about the role of facilitation as opposed to, you know, extracting or reporting on. So I think it's I think that that's something that I would really like to see a shift in, and it, not just in relationship to you know, prison journalism, but just like journalism as a whole. Yeah, that's what I would say.
There's an incredible quote by the public media advocate, Daryl Holiday, who's out of Chicago. I recommend everybody check out his work, but he says that journalists often think of themselves with a hero mentality, like we're here at the top and we're doing this all alone and we're telling, and he says the hero mentality actually goes against how communities work and function. And so how can you do work in community? How can you do collaborative work? And how can you use those values to build better media and storytelling systems?
What was his name again?
Daryl Holiday. He started City Bureau out of Chicago and the Documenters program, which I just think is doing some of the most innovative public media work in the country right now. So I highly recommend folks that are interested, check him out.
That's great. I don't need to add to what these two said. It was wonderful.
Okay, and I'm going to ask one more. Let's like quick question, and then just ask for sort of parting thoughts. So, Francine, I realize this is the questions are very big, which makes it complicated. But I think we covered some of these things. But just like, are there very specific things that you can list around the communications? Let's see, very specific rules around communications. And inmate internet access. Do you support unfettered access? Like, what are some of the technical things that could change to shift the way the stories are allowed to be told?
I mean, the easiest things that the prisons could do is allow cell phones and allow internet access. You know, Adnan Khan, who I mentioned, said his illegal cell phone in prison was the most rehabilitative tool he had. It allowed him to connect with his family and connect with the outside world and people who were helping him grow and know his life was still valuable. And, you know, illegal phones are endemic within prisons. There's quite a lot of people who have them. And I think if the system were to acknowledge that that's a reality, and that it's actually could help people have better outcomes, could help rehabilitation, could help people make their way out, could help the institutions be actually more safe. I mean, the reason they don't have phones is like, oh, they're going to use it to do dangerous stuff and it's going to affect the security of the institution. Well, another way to look at it is that security and the well-being of the institution is going to have to do with how well people are, and a phone is a great tool for that. So, you know, I'm in favor of lifting any kind of regulations that are limiting communications to people on the inside. But if you are on the outside and want to communicate, at least in California, you can actually look up any incarcerated person by their full name via something that's called the inmate locator. Now, the word inmate is not preferred by a lot of incarcerated people, but CDCR still uses it. But you just Google that, you could find someone's name, you can write to them at their institution. You could use something called JPay to write to them basically over the internet, and they'll get a printout and they could write back to you. You could also set up a phone call through Global Tellink, the prison phone system profiteer, that will charge you, you know, 5 cents a minute or something higher to talk to someone. But that's a really meaningful way to make a connection. So another call to action is, you know, find a way to make a pen pal, or have someone you talk to over the phone. Maybe there's someone already in your community and in your life who's incarcerated who you're not so connected with, who you could reach out to.
Great. So I don't know if this is like a Commonwealth Club. This is my first GGU event, but I feel like I should end this on time. So again, I want to thank the San Francisco Public Relations Roundtable and Golden Gate University for organizing this program. And I'm really grateful to Adamu, Emily, and Eli for being here today. It's been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all. It was a great conversation.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate you. Thanks, Emily and Eli.
Thanks, Adamu.
Thanks, Ken.